Sir Reginald Harcourt lived at No. 17 Bishop's Court, a quiet, ivy-clad cul-de-sac nestled incongruously in the heart of London. It was a place frozen in time, untouched by the hurried chaos beyond its wrought-iron gates. For a man like Sir Reginald, once the most formidable criminal prosecutor in the country, this retreat was ideal. Retired now, he spent his days indulging in his vast collection of rare legal manuscripts, and his nights sipping fine cognac by the dim glow of his study's fireplace. On this particular evening, the wind outside howled like a hungry thing, rattling the panes of the tall windows. Sir Reginald, deep in the pages of an obscure criminology text, barely noticed when his butler, Clements, stepped in with his usual impeccable silence. "A visitor for you, sir, a lady. She insists you will want to see her." Sir Reginald frowned. "A lady? At this hour? Did she give her name?" "No, sir, but she was quite certain you would recognize her." Intrigued, he set down his book and gestured toward the door. "Show her in." The woman who entered was striking, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but compelling, her presence commanding. She was tall, dressed in an elegant black coat, and a close-fitting hat that framed her dark eyes. There was something familiar in the set of her jaw, the determined way she strode forward, her gloved hand extended. "Sir Reginald," she said, her voice carrying a strange mix of warmth and urgency. "It's been a long time." Recognition hit him like a slow creeping tide. Eleanor, a ghost from the past, one he had not expected to see again. Their last encounter had been aboard the Concordia, a transatlantic voyage that had ended in scandal and whispers of treachery. He had once been enchanted by her sharp wit and keen mind, but something darker had always lurked beneath the surface. She smiled, but her eyes did not. "I need your help." Sir Reginald gestured for her to sit, but he remained standing, studying her with the same piercing gaze that had broken so many witnesses on the stand. Help or absolution? For a fraction of a second, he saw something flicker in her eyes, fear or perhaps guilt. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Eleanor leaned forward. "There's no time for games, Reginald. A man is dead, and they think I killed him." A flicker of something unspoken passed through his mind as he pressed her hand, the warmth of memory lingering longer than it should have. "This is an unexpected pleasure," Sir Reginald said smoothly, gesturing toward the chair by the fire. He arranged it with practiced ease, his manner cordial, his mind racing. Why had she come back after all these years? He let the conversation drift through polite pleasantries, an easy rhythm of words meant to steady the moment, but he was watching her, always watching. There was tension in the way she sat, fingers curling and uncurling against the velvet arm of the chair, her lips parting, as if rehearsing what she meant to say. And then, as suddenly as the hush that had settled between them, she spoke. "Reginald, I need your help." A simple sentence, yet something in its urgency cut through the air like a knife. He leaned back slightly, a measured pause before he answered, his voice instinctively cautious. "Go on," she exhaled, as if bracing herself. "You told me once, if ever I was in trouble, if I ever needed anything, you would help me." He stilled. Yes, he had said those words, the kind of promise one makes in the flush of sentiment, in the charged moments of departure, when the weight of finality makes every word seem heavier, more binding. He could still recall the way he had lifted her hand to his lips, the emotion thick in his voice. "If ever you should need me." But words spoken in the past were easy to forget, until they came knocking on the door, demanding to be honored. 9 years, or was it 10? The woman before him was still striking, but the softness of youth had given way to something sharper, something carved by experience. A younger man might have found her more compelling now, more intriguing, but Sir Reginald, ever the analyst, only saw the shadows behind her eyes, the weight pressing against her voice. The warmth of memory faded, replaced by the steely precision of a man who had spent his life dissecting lies from truth. "My dear Eleanor," he said finally, his tone brisk, measured, "of course I will do what I can, though I suspect my usefulness is not what it once was." If he had meant to lay the groundwork for polite refusal, she didn't notice, or perhaps she refused to. Some people saw only what they needed to see, and right now, She saw nothing but her own desperation. She spoke with an urgency that left no room for doubt, as if his agreement had already been secured. "We are in terrible trouble, Sir Reginald." "We?" His brow lifted slightly. "You are married?" "No, I meant my brother and me, and Thomas and Eleanor too, for that matter." She drew a shaky breath. "I should explain. My aunt, Miss Hargreaves, she was murdered." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Sir Reginald's sharp eyes. "Hargreaves, yes, I remember reading about it. A brutal affair. Blunt force trauma, wasn't it?" She nodded, her fingers twisting together. 3 weeks ago, and they haven't caught the killer. I don't think they ever will." "Why do you say that?" She hesitated, then leaned forward as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Because there may not be a killer to catch." A sharp silence stretched between them, thick with implication. Reginald's interest sharpened. "Explain." She swallowed hard. "The police know no one entered the house that night. No stranger, no outsider. They're certain of it, which means," she faltered, her voice barely above a whisper, "it must have been one of us." A long pause, then quietly, Sir Reginald asked, "You are saying that the murderer is a member of your household?" She nodded, and her voice trembled as she continued, "They haven't accused us, not directly, but we feel it, we see it in their eyes. They've searched the house, questioned us again and again, and because they don't know who did it, they're just waiting, watching, and we're watching each other." Her voice cracked. "It's unbearable. Every meal, every conversation, none of us trust the other, none of us know who." She broke off, her breath unsteady. Reginald studied her, his mind methodically assembling the pieces. "Who are the 4 of you?" She straightened, forcing composure. "Myself, my brother Matthew, and our cousins, Thomas and Eleanor. Aunt Margaret was our great-aunt, our grandmother's sister." Reginald's gaze did not waver. "And you truly believe that one of you killed her?" She let out a ragged breath. "I don't know what I believe anymore. We had lived with her since we were 14.
Matthew and I.
We're twins, you see. And then there was Thomas Hargreaves, her nephew, her late brother's son. He and his wife, Eleanor, lived there too." "She supported them?" Sir Reginald asked, his sharp gaze locked on hers. "For the most part. Thomas has some money of his own, but his health has never been strong. He's quiet, withdrawn, the kind of man who loses himself in books, in old letters. I can't imagine." She stopped abruptly, shuddering. "No, it's unthinkable." Reginald folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." She nodded, inhaling deeply. "It's all still so clear in my mind, horribly clear. That evening, everything seemed so ordinary. We had tea together, as always, and then we each went about our usual routines. I was in my room, sewing. Matthew was typing an article. He writes a little, you know, for magazines. Thomas was upstairs with his stamp collection, and Eleanor, she never came down for tea at all. She had taken one of her headache powders, and was resting." She paused, her fingers tightening in her lap. "And then, at 7:30, Martha, our maid, went in to lay supper. That's when she found Aunt Margaret. Her head was—" She shut her eyes for a moment, as if forcing the image away. "Her head was crushed, smashed in." A heavy silence settled between them. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across Reginald's face. "The weapon?" he asked at last. "A paperweight, a heavy brass one shaped like a lion. It always sat on the small table by the study door." Her voice dropped. "The police found it wiped clean of fingerprints." Reginald absorbed this, his expression giving nothing away. "And your first thought?" "We assumed it was a burglary gone wrong. The writing desk had been ransacked, drawers pulled open as if someone had been searching for something. But," she hesitated, then whispered, "but nothing was missing." His eyes sharpened. "Nothing at all." She shook her head. "No jewelry, no money, no documents. Nothing was taken, which means the ransacking was staged." A cold weight settled in her stomach. "Yes," she whispered. "That's what the police believe. And if that's true, it wasn't an outsider." She exhaled unsteadily. "It was one of us." Reginald leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then the question is no longer how she was killed, but why. And that, my dear, is where we must begin. Of course we thought it was a burglary. What else could it have been?" Her voice trembled, her fingers twisting together in her lap. But then the police arrived, and everything changed. They examined the body, checked the house, and said Aunt Margaret had been dead for at least an hour before she was found. That meant she had been killed sometime between 6:30 and 7:30. They asked Martha, our housekeeper, if anyone had entered or left during that time, and she swore nobody had. She took a shaky breath. Then they checked all the windows, all the doors. Everything was locked from the inside. No forced entry, no signs of tampering. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's when they started looking at us. She met Sir Reginald's gaze, searching for reassurance, but his expression remained unreadable. For instance, he said coolly, who stood to benefit from your aunt's death? That's simple. We all did, equally. She swallowed. Aunt Margaret's will left her fortune divided into 4 equal shares, one for each of us. Sir Reginald leaned forward slightly. And how much is her estate worth? The solicitor said it would be around £80,000 after taxes. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That is quite a considerable sum. Did you know your aunt was that wealthy? She shook her head quickly. No, none of us did. She was always careful with money, always talking about being frugal. We had only one servant, and she constantly reminded us of the need to economize. We never imagined she had such a fortune tucked away. Sir Reginald tapped a finger lightly against the armrest of his chair, deep in thought. Magdalen leaned forward, urgency burning in her eyes. You will help me, you will. Her sudden intensity caught him off guard. Just moments ago he had been listening purely out of curiosity, drawn in by the intrigue of her story. But now this was something else, something personal. My dear young lady, he said cautiously, what can I possibly do? If you need legal assistance, I can recommend an excellent firm. She cut him off. Oh, I don't want that. I need you personally. He frowned slightly. In what capacity? As a friend. Her voice softened, took on an almost desperate edge. I want you to come to the house. I want you to ask questions, to observe. I need you to see things for yourself. Sir Reginald hesitated. But surely you promised, she said firmly. Years ago you said that, if I ever needed help, if there was anything you could do, you would do it. Anywhere, anytime. Her eyes held his, pleading yet unwavering. Did you mean it? The weight of her belief in his long-forgotten promise struck him. It had been nothing but a casual farewell, a gentleman's courtesy, spoken in the warmth of parting. A decade had passed since then, and yet to her, those words had remained solid and binding. How many men had uttered such assurances without ever being called upon to fulfill them? And yet, here she was, holding him to it. He sighed, rubbing his temple. I'm sure there are others more qualified to assist you. I have friends, of course I do, she said quickly. There was something almost amusing in her absolute confidence. But they aren't clever like you. They don't understand people the way you do. You've spent your life questioning suspects, listening to lies, uncovering the truth. You know what? Whether someone is innocent or guilty. Sir Reginald gave a small knowing smile. He prided himself on exactly that, on seeing past facades, on detecting the cracks beneath the surface. Many times, his private judgments had differed from those of juries. Magdalen suddenly sat back in her chair, pushing her hat from her forehead. She glanced around the quiet study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the bookshelves and heavy curtains. A slow shiver ran through her. It's too quiet in here, she murmured. Don't you ever long for noise? Sir Reginald studied her, watching the way her fingers traced invisible patterns against the arm of her chair. There was something almost feverish about her now, something restless. Perhaps, he thought, it was not only the house she wanted him to investigate. Perhaps she feared something deeper, something unspoken, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was right to. The cul-de-sac. Magdalen had spoken the words carelessly, without thought, but they struck something deep within Sir Reginald. A cul-de-sac, yes, but there was always a way out, the same way one had come, the way back into the world, the way back to something resembling clarity. Something impetuous and youthful stirred within him, something he had not felt in years. Her simple trust, her unwavering faith in him, touched the best part of his nature, the part that once believed in the pursuit of truth above all else. But there was something more. Her problem, the tangled mystery of it, appealed to a different side of him, the deep-rooted criminologist within. The need to unravel, to observe, to analyze, was almost instinctual. He wanted to see the people she had spoken of, to study them, to judge them for himself. "If you truly believe I can be of any use," he began cautiously. "Mind you, I make no promises." He expected an outburst of gratitude, perhaps even breathless excitement, but Magdalene simply nodded, as though she had never doubted him. "I knew you would do it," she said simply. "I've always thought of you as a real friend." Then, with a quiet determination, "Will you come back with me now?" He shook his head. "No. I think a visit tomorrow would be more satisfactory. In the meantime, I'd like the name and address of Miss Crabtree's lawyer. I may have a few questions for him." She reached for the notepad on the small writing desk and scribbled down the details, tearing the page carefully before handing it to him. There was something oddly deliberate about the way she did it, as though she knew that every small step she took now was one toward uncovering a truth she might not be ready for. She rose to her feet then, hesitating slightly before saying, "I'm really most awfully grateful. Goodbye." "And your own address?" he asked. "How stupid of me," she said with a small laugh. 18 Palatine Walk, Chelsea. He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, and as he stood there gazing at the slip of paper in his hand, he felt something shift. He was no longer just a listener to an intriguing tale. He was now a part of it. At precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Sir Reginald approached 18 Palatine Walk. His gait was measured, his expression unreadable. He had spent the morning in careful preparation, gathering pieces of a puzzle that had yet to take shape. His first stop had been Scotland Yard, where the Assistant Commissioner, an old acquaintance, had provided him with a few undisclosed details. The case, though not yet making headlines, had intrigued the authorities due to its unusual circumstances. There was something about it, the Commissioner had said, that felt off, and Sir Reginald agreed. From there he had visited the office of Miss Crabtree's lawyer. It had been an illuminating conversation. Miss Crabtree's financial habits had been peculiar. Unlike most individuals of her means, she never used a checkbook, nor did she keep large sums in a bank. Instead, she operated in cash, specifically £5 notes. Every 3 months, without fail, she would write to her solicitor, requesting exactly £300 to be kept aside for her. She would then arrive personally to collect it, always traveling by four-wheeler, a method she considered the only safe means of transport. It was an antiquated, almost paranoid practice, but it spoke volumes. Sir Reginald now walked up the steps of 18 Palatine Walk, his sharp mind cataloguing these details, weaving them into something that resembled logic. The truth, he had learned long ago, was rarely found in dramatic revelations. It was in the small overlooked details, the habits, the inconsistencies, the choices that seemed unimportant until they were suddenly everything. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as though someone had been waiting, and so it began. Miss Crabtree never left the house, except for those quarterly visits to her lawyer. At all other times she remained within the walls of 18 Palatine Walk, her world small, contained, guarded. At Scotland Yard, Sir Edward had listened carefully as the Assistant Commissioner laid out the details. The financial aspect of the case had been examined meticulously. Miss Crabtree had been due for her next installment of cash within the week. If her past habits held true, she had either spent the previous £300 or had only a fraction of it left. But this, as it turned out, was a more complicated question than it seemed. An analysis of the household expenses showed that Miss Crabtree's total expenditure per quarter fell significantly short of £300. A woman who lived so frugally, so cautiously, should have had savings, yet there were none. And yet there was an explanation, at least a partial one. She had a habit of sending £5 notes to distant relatives, to old friends who had fallen on hard times. Generous in her way, though always careful, always precise. But the real question, the one that still lingered unanswered, was this: how much money had been in the house at the time of her death? And more importantly, where was it now? None had been found. It was this thought that occupied Sir. As he made his way down the quiet street toward Palatine Walk, the house itself was unremarkable, a non-basement structure with a narrow facade, its windows shuttered against the grey afternoon light. He climbed the short set of steps and knocked. The door was opened promptly, as if his arrival had been anticipated. A small elderly woman with sharp eyes stood before him. There was something brisk about her, a sense of efficiency in the way she held herself. Without a word, she stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Inside he was led into a large double drawing room to the left of the narrow hallway. The air was heavy, the curtains drawn just enough to cast long shadows across the floral-patterned carpet. The place had the unmistakable stillness of a house that had known death. And then Magdalen appeared. Even in the dim light, he could see the signs of strain on her face, the tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers trembled slightly before she clasped them together in an attempt to still them. "You told me to ask questions," Sir Edward said, offering her a small reassuring smile as he extended his hand, "and I have come to do so." She nodded, her grip firm but cold. "First I want to establish something very clearly. Who was the last person to see your aunt alive, and at exactly what time?" Magdalen hesitated, for only a fraction of a second before answering. "It was after tea, around 5 o'clock. Martha was the last person with her. Martha, our housekeeper. She had been paying the household accounts that afternoon. She brought Aunt Lily the change and the receipt before returning to her duties." "And you trust Martha?" Magdalen's answer came swiftly, without hesitation. "Oh, absolutely. She was with Aunt Lily for, 30 years I suppose. She's honest as the day." Sir Edward nodded thoughtfully. A woman of habit, a household where money was handled with precision, and yet in the end, not a single banknote remained to be found. Yes, something was very wrong here, and he intended to find out what. Sir Edward leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, his voice calm but probing. "Another question. Why did your cousin, Mrs. Crabtree, take a headache powder?" Magdalen blinked, as though surprised by the sudden shift in direction. "Well, because she had a headache, naturally," he said. "But was there any particular reason why she should have a headache?" She hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Well, yes, in a way. There was a bit of a scene at lunch. Emily is highly strung, easily upset. She and Aunt Lily had rows sometimes." Sir Edward's expression remained unreadable. "And they had one that day?" "Yes, Aunt Lily could be difficult about little things. It started over nothing really, but suddenly it escalated. One moment they were arguing about how much salt should go into the soup, and the next Emily was saying all sorts of things she couldn't possibly have meant, such as," Magdalen bit her lip, "that she'd leave the house and never come back, that she was grudged every mouthful she ate, that she felt like a prisoner here." She exhaled sharply, as though reliving the moment. "And Aunt Lily, well, she didn't hold back either. She told Emily and William they could pack their boxes and leave if they were so miserable. But of course," Sir Edward said mildly, "they didn't." "No," Magdalen shook her head. "It all meant nothing really, just words, because they couldn't afford to leave." Magdalen hesitated before nodding. "Yes, but it wasn't just about money. William, he was fond of Aunt Lily, despite everything. He really was." Sir Edward tapped a finger lightly on the armrest of his chair, his mind working. "It wasn't a day of quarrels by any chance." Magdalen stiffened slightly. "You mean me? You had a disagreement with your aunt as well, didn't you? Something about your career?" She flushed. "Yes, the fuss about my wanting to be a mannequin. Your aunt disapproved. She wouldn't even hear of it." Sir Edward studied her. "Why did you want to be a mannequin, Miss Magdalen? Does the life seem so attractive to you?" She let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, but anything would be better than living here." A pause, a small shift in the air. Then Sir Edward said, his voice deceptively light, "Yes then, but now you will have a comfortable income, won't you?" Magdalen's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded without hesitation. "Oh yes, it's quite different now." There was something in the simplicity of her answer that made Sir Edward smile, but he let the subject drop. Instead he asked, "And your brother, did he have a quarrel too, Matthew?" She shook her head quickly. "Oh no, then no one could say he had a motive for wanting your aunt out of the way." It was a simple statement, but in that brief moment, Something flickered across Magdalen's face, too fast to be disguised. A flash of hesitation, a moment of unease. Sir Edward caught it instantly. "I forgot," he said, almost carelessly. "He owed a good deal of money, didn't he?" Magdalen's lips parted slightly. She said nothing, but her fingers tightened on the edge of her dress, just for a second. Sir Edward leaned back, satisfied. Yes, this was getting interesting. Yes. Poor old Matthew. Sir Edward observed her closely. The phrase was offhand, almost mechanical. No flicker of hesitation, no shadow of unease. "And yet, still, that will be all right now," he remarked. "Yes." She exhaled softly, almost unconsciously. "It is a relief." And still she saw nothing. Nothing in his careful phrasing, nothing in the watchfulness of his gaze. He changed the subject abruptly. "Your cousins and your brother, are they at home?" "Yes, I told them you were coming. They are all so anxious to help." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then leaned forward impulsively. "Oh, Sir Edward, I feel, somehow, that you are going to find out that everything is all right, that none of us had anything to do with it, that after all it was an outsider." Sir Edward held her gaze, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I can't do miracles. I may be able to find out the truth, but I can't make the truth be what you want it to be." She drew back slightly, her expression unreadable. "Can't you?" she murmured. Then with a sudden wistful intensity, "I feel that you could do anything, anything." She left the room before he could respond. For a moment he remained motionless, staring after her, an unsettling thought forming in his mind. What did she mean by that? It had been a plea, yes, but for what? A verdict? A carefully chosen version of events? Does she want me to suggest a line of defense? And if so, for whom? His thoughts were interrupted by the entrance of a man in his 50s. He had the air of someone once physically imposing, now softened by time and complacency. His suit, though expensive, was rumpled, his hair in disarray. He moved with the absent-mindedness of a man who spent much of his life in a world of his own. "Sir Edward Palliser, oh, how do you do?" he said, with a distracted sort of affability. "Magdalen sent me along. It's very good of you, I'm sure, to wish to help us, though to be quite honest, I don't think anything will ever really be discovered. I mean, they won't catch the fellow." Sir Edward studied him. "You think it was a burglar then? Someone from outside?" "Well, it must have been. It couldn't be one of the family." A slight emphasis on must. "These fellows are very clever nowadays," he continued, warming to his theory. "Climb like cats, they do, silent as shadows, in and out before anyone knows a thing." Sir Edward tilted his head slightly. "Where were you, Mr. Crabtree, when the tragedy occurred?" "Oh, busy with my stamps. In my little sitting room upstairs." "You didn't hear anything?" A faintly sheepish smile. "No, but then I never do hear anything when I'm absorbed. Very foolish of me. But there it is. A practiced excuse, or simply the truth of a man used to retreating into his own world?" Sir Edward's voice remained mild, almost casual. "Is the sitting room you refer to over this one?" "No, it's at the back," he answered quickly. Too quickly. Sir Edward made a mental note of it. This was a house where words mattered, and sometimes the most important thing was not what was said, but what was left unsaid. Again the door opened. A small fair woman entered, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped bird. Her hands twitched restlessly at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling as if grasping at something unseen. There was an air of nervous excitement about her, a suppressed energy that made Sir Edward take immediate notice. "William, why didn't you wait for me?" she snapped, her voice high-pitched, brittle. "I said wait." Her husband sighed, his earlier vagueness settling back over him like a cloak. "Sorry, my dear, I forgot." He turned towards Sir Edward with a half-hearted gesture. "Sir Edward Palliser, my wife." She faced him with a jerky, uncertain nod, her pale lips pressing together in a tight line. "How do you do, Mrs. Crabtree?" Sir Edward's tone was polite, but probing. "I hope you don't mind my coming here to ask a few questions. I know how anxious you must all be to have things cleared up." "Of course," she said quickly, her fingers twisting together. "Naturally. But I can't tell you anything. Can I, William?" She turned to her husband, seeking reassurance. I was asleep on my bed. I only woke up when Martha screamed. Her hands twitched again. Sir Edward watched her carefully. Where is your room, Mrs. Crabtree? It's over this, she answered at once. Then almost defensively, but I didn't hear anything. How could I? I was asleep. The words came out too fast, too forceful, as though she had rehearsed them in her mind. The insistence in her voice was the insistence of someone who needed to be believed. Still, Sir Edward knew that her fear did not necessarily mean guilt. It might just as easily be the panic of an innocent woman, desperate not to be drawn into suspicion. He had seen it before. People who, though entirely blameless, became so consumed by fear that they only made themselves appear more suspect. He excused himself at last, sensing he would get no more from her. I'd like to put a few questions to Martha, he said lightly. William Crabtree nodded, seemingly relieved to move on. I'll take you to the kitchen. They stepped into the hall, and just then Sir Edward nearly collided with a tall, dark young man, striding toward the front door with the unmistakable air of someone eager to escape. Mr. Matthew Vaughan? Sir Edward asked smoothly. The young man barely broke stride. Yes, but look here, I can't wait. I've got an appointment. His tone was clipped, impatient. His face, though strikingly handsome, was drawn tight with irritation. Matthew. A voice came from the staircase. Magdalen. She was descending quickly, her expression tense with urgency. Oh, Matthew, you promised. I know, sis. He exhaled sharply, exasperated. But I can't. Got to meet a fellow. His gaze flicked to Sir Edward, then away, dismissing him. And anyway, what's the good of talking about the damned thing over and over again? We have enough of that with the police. I'm fed up with the whole show. Sir Edward said nothing, merely watched. A man in a hurry, a man restless, eager to be elsewhere. And yet why that flicker of unease in his eyes? The barely concealed tension in the set of his jaw. Sir Edward had met many men like Matthew Vaughan before. Some were guilty, some were not, but all of them, every last one, were hiding something. The front door banged. Matthew Vaughan had gone. His exit had been abrupt, final, too final. Sir Edward watched the door for a moment, then turned away, his thoughts whirring. A man eager to leave always raised questions. He was led through the dimly lit corridor into the kitchen. The scent of starch and scorched linen filled the air. Martha stood by the ironing board, an iron gripped firmly in her hand. The kitchen was warm, but her face was pale, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She looked up at him as he entered, but didn't speak. Sir Edward shut the door softly behind him. Miss Vaughan has asked me to help her, he began, his voice measured, gentle. I hope you won't mind a few questions. Martha held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head, her expression grim. None of them did it, sir. Her voice was steady but laced with defiance. I know what you're thinking, but it isn't so. As nice a set of ladies and gentlemen as you could wish to see. Sir Edward allowed himself the smallest of smiles. I've no doubt of it, but their niceness isn't what we call evidence, you know. Perhaps not, sir, Martha said, her grip on the iron tightening. The law's a funny thing, but there is evidence, as you call it, sir. And I can tell you this much. None of them could have done it without me knowing. Sir Edward raised an eyebrow, but surely she cut across him. I know what I'm talking about, sir. A sharp creak echoed above their heads. There, listen to that. Sir Edward paused. The sound came again, a groan of protesting wood from the staircase. The stairs, sir, Martha explained. They creak something awful. Doesn't matter how careful you are, how slow you go. Mrs. Crabtree was lying on her bed. Mr. Crabtree was fiddling about with them wretched stamps of his. Miss Magdalen, she was up in her room, working her machine. Same as always. If any one of them had come down those stairs, I would have known. And they didn't. She folded her arms across her chest. Her voice was firm, absolute. Sir Edward studied her. She was certain, utterly certain, and certainty, he had learned, was either the mark of a fool, or a witness worth listening to. A good witness, he thought. She'd carry weight. He shifted his approach. That accounts for 3 of them. But what about the 4th? He paused. Was Mr. Matthew Vaughan upstairs as well? Martha hesitated, but only for a moment. No, she admitted, but he was in the little room downstairs. Next door. Sir Edward frowned. And you're sure of that? I am, sir. He was typewriting, and you can hear it plain from here. She sniffed as if the memory of the sound irritated her even now. A nasty, irritating tap-tapping noise it is. Sir Edward considered this, and it never stopped, not for a moment, sir. I can swear to that. A silence settled between them. Sir Edward let it linger. Finally he said, "It was you who found her, wasn't it?" Martha's fingers curled around the iron's handle. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice quieter now. "It was me." Sir Edward Martha swallowed. Her face, so defiant before, seemed older now, haunted. She was lying there. She murmured, blood in her hair. Poor thing. Her eyes flickered, distant, as if seeing the scene again. "No one heard a sound," she whispered. "Not a sound, on account of the tap-tapping of Mr. Matthew's typewriter." Sir Edward exhaled slowly. The typewriter, a perfect alibi, or a perfect distraction. Sir Edward's gaze rested on Martha. Steady and unyielding. "You're certain no one came into the house?" Martha lifted her chin slightly. "How could they, sir? Without my knowing. The bell rings in here, and there's only the one door." Her certainty was firm, but certainty, Sir Edward had learned, was often the first veil over an inconvenient truth. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You were fond of Miss Crabtree, weren't you?" A shift, small but undeniable. Her features hardened with years of service, softened. A warmth crept into her face, something real, something unguarded. "Yes, indeed. I was, sir." She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders, as if bracing for something. "But for Miss Crabtree, well, I don't mind saying it now. I got into trouble when I was a girl, sir. And Miss Crabtree, she stood by me, took me back into her service when it was all over. No one else would. I'd have died for her. I would indeed." Sir Edward knew sincerity when he heard it. There was no artifice in Martha's voice, no hesitation, no calculation. She was telling the truth. He nodded. "Then as far as you know, no one came to the door. No one could have come," she insisted. He corrected her gently. "As far as you know, but what if Miss Crabtree was expecting someone? If she let them in herself?" For the first time Martha faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, her mouth opening slightly as if to object, then closing just as fast. "Oh," the sound was barely more than a breath. "It's possible, isn't it?" Sir Edward pressed. She might have seen someone from the window. Someone she was waiting for. Someone she didn't want anyone else to see. She might have gone to the door herself. Martha's lips thinned. Her hands, which had been clasped before her, tightened until her knuckles whitened. "It's possible, yes." The words were reluctant, drawn from her as though against her will. "But it isn't likely, I mean."
She trailed off.
She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Sir Edward studied her. The way her gaze flew,
Way she bit the inside of her cheek. Was she struggling against an instinct? A belief? Or was it knowledge?
She was honest. Of that he was sure. But honesty and loyalty were not the same thing. Had the stairs really been silent that night? Had someone crept down, unseen? Had Martha, deep down, known who, and had she chosen silence? Sir Edward let the pause stretch, the weight of it pressing down, then softly, almost conversationally, he said, "It wouldn't have to be just anyone, would it? If she let them in herself, it must have been someone she trusted, someone she wanted to see." Martha swallowed. A slow, reluctant nod. "Yes," she admitted at last. "You may be right, sir. I never thought of that she was expecting a gentleman. Yes, it well might be." But even as she spoke, she looked troubled, because if Miss Crabtree had expected a visitor, then that visitor had betrayed her. And that Martha could not bear to believe. For a moment Martha seemed to hesitate, as though some thought had only just struck her. A flicker of realization passed across her face, subtle but unmistakable. It was as though she had begun to perceive an advantage in the idea. Sir Edward caught it. He had seen it before, that brief uncertain moment, when a witness considered whether a truth was inconvenient or necessary. He didn't let the pause stretch too long before speaking. "You were the last person to see her alive, were you not?" Martha straightened. The habitual discipline of a lifelong...
Servant asserting itself. Yes, sir.
After I'd cleared away the tea.
Yes, sir. Sita, 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 Sita.
A £5 note, sir, Martha replied, sounding almost scandalized by the suggestion of anything larger. The book never came up as high as £5. I'm very careful with accounts. Where did she keep her money? Martha hesitated again, then gave a small shrug. I don't rightly know, sir. I'd say she carried it about with her, in her black velvet bag. But of course she might have kept some in her bedroom drawers. Those were always locked. She was cautious then. Oh, very, sir. Always locking things up, though prone to losing her keys. Sir Edward nodded, filing that detail away. You don't know how much money she had in £5 notes, I mean. No, sir. I couldn't say what the exact amount was. And she said nothing that might lead you to believe she was expecting anyone that evening. No, sir. You're quite sure? He watched her carefully. What exactly did she say to you? Martha's brow furrowed as she searched her memory. Well, she said the butcher was nothing more than a rogue and a cheat. And she said I'd brought in £1/4 more tea than I ought to have. Then she said Mrs. Crabtree was full of nonsense for refusing to eat margarine. She paused, thinking. Oh, and she didn't like one of the sixpences I gave her. One of those new ones with the oak leaves on it. Said it was bad. I had a lot of trouble convincing her otherwise. Martha's eyes flicked toward the window as if she could still hear the sharp voice of her mistress berating the coin. Then she continued, almost absent-mindedly, as if the memory pulled her along. And she was cross about the fishmonger sending haddocks instead of whitings, asked if I'd told him about it, and I said I had. And, she trailed off, then shrugged. Really, sir, I think that's all. It was a small, seemingly trivial account of an ordinary evening, yet to Sir Edward it painted a vivid picture, far more revealing than any formal description could have been. He could see the late Miss Crabtree in his mind now, fussy and particular, scolding, fretting over sixpences and fish orders, wielding her authority over the household in whatever small way she could. He tilted his head. A rather difficult mistress to please, wouldn't you say? Martha pursed her lips. A bit fussy, yes. But there, sir, she didn't get out much. Stuck inside, she had to have something to busy herself with. She was pernickety, but kind-hearted all the same. Never a beggar turned away from the door without something in his hand. Fussy she may have been, but a real charitable lady. Sir Edward studied her. There was no falsehood in her tone, but something in her eyes, something unsettled. Perhaps it was simply grief, or perhaps somewhere beneath that unwavering loyalty, Martha knew more than she was willing to say. I am glad, Martha, that at least one person truly regrets her passing. Martha's breath caught. A flicker of something, guilt, fear, passed across her weathered face. You mean, oh, but they were all fond of her. Really, underneath it all, they had their differences, of course. But it never meant anything, sir. Sir Edward watched her, weighing the words. Affection could be a strange thing, fraught, tangled, but was there truth in Martha's voice, or was she merely reassuring herself? Above them, a floorboard creaked. Sir Edward's gaze snapped upward. That's Miss Magdalen coming down, Martha murmured. He turned sharply. How do you know? A deep flush spread across the old woman's cheeks. I know her step, she muttered. The reply was quiet, but something in it unsettled Sir Edward. He did not press further. Instead he left the kitchen swiftly. Martha had been right. Magdalen had just reached the bottom of the staircase. Her expression was taut, hopeful, as though she expected good news. Sir Edward gave none. Not much progress yet, I'm afraid. he said evenly. Then his tone shifting, he added, "You don't happen to know what letters your aunt received on the day of her death?" Magdalene hesitated. "They are all together. The police have already examined them, of course." Without further prompting, she turned and led the way into the large formal drawing room. The heavy curtains dimmed the afternoon light, casting long shadows against the ornate furniture. She crossed to a polished writing desk, unlocked a drawer, and withdrew a large black velvet handbag with an old-fashioned silver clasp. "This is Aunt's bag," she said quietly. "Everything inside is exactly as it was that day. I've left it untouched." Sir Edward took the bag from her hands with measured care. "Thank you, Miss Magdalene." He carried it to a side table, set it down, and methodically turned out its contents. The items spread before him like scattered puzzle pieces, each one a clue, each one meaningless without the others. Loose silver coins, dulled by age, 2 ginger nuts, crumbling at the edges, 3 yellowed newspaper clippings about Joanna Southcott's box, odd reading material, a cheaply printed poem, something sentimental about the hardships of the unemployed, a battered copy of Old Moore's Almanac, its pages creased with use, a lump of camphor, wrapped in tissue, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and 3 letters. Sir Edward picked them up one by one. The first, written in spidery ink, was from someone called Cousin Lucy. The second, a terse bill for mending a watch. The third, a standard appeal from a charitable institution. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest why Miss Crabtree had died that night. And yet, Sir Edward frowned. Something was wrong. The assortment of objects in the bag painted a portrait of an elderly woman's peculiar habits, but what it did not do was explain absence. Was there something missing? Had something been taken out of the bag before the police arrived? His fingers lingered on the aged velvet, deep in thought. He repacked everything with careful precision, fastening the silver clasp with a quiet snap. Then, exhaling slowly, he handed the bag back to Magdalene. "Thank you," he said again, but his mind was elsewhere. The answers he needed were not in the bag. They were in the spaces between the objects, the things that should have been there but weren't, the silence between Martha's words, the flicker of uncertainty in Magdalene's eyes, and the creak of the floorboard upstairs, too slight to be an accident, too deliberate to be ignored. Someone in this house knew the truth. Someone was watching, and someone somewhere had just made a mistake. "I'm afraid there isn't much there." Sir Edward rose, his gaze lingering on the window. From here one could clearly see the front doorstep, the very place where perhaps a crucial moment had occurred. Then, turning to Magdalene, he took her hand in his grip firm but unreadable. "You are leaving?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet apprehension.
"Look, yes."
"But it's going to be all right, isn't it?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through Sir Edward's sharp eyes. "Nobody connected with the law ever commits himself to a rash statement like that," he said solemnly. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped away, making his exit before she could question him further. Outside, the cool air did little to clear the weight in his mind. He walked along the narrow street, his thoughts circling like vultures over the unanswered questions. The pieces were all there, scattered before him like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Yet the one vital piece, the one that would make everything fall into place, eluded him. A nagging feeling told him he was close, so very close. A hand clapped down on his shoulder. He started, instincts flaring, but it was only Matthew Vaughan, slightly out of breath. "I've been chasing you, Sir Edward," Vaughan admitted, a sheepish note in his voice. "I wanted to apologize, for earlier, I was out of line, but well, I've not got the best temper in the world, I'm afraid." He hesitated, then added, "It's awfully good of you to bother with all this. If there's anything I can do to help." Sir Edward was only half listening. His body had gone rigid, his eyes no longer on Vaughan, but locked on something beyond him. Across the street, a stillness settled over him, his mind sharpening like the edge of a blade. Matthew, puzzled by the sudden shift, repeated, "If there's anything I can do to help." Sir Edward inhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was laced with quiet satisfaction. "You have already done it, my dear young man." Matthew blinked. "I have? Yes." Sir Edward's lips curved slightly, though his gaze never left the spot across the street. "By stopping me at this precise moment, at this particular place, and making me see what I might otherwise have missed. The wind stirred through the alley, carrying the scent of damp stone and old secrets. The answer had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, and now finally, he knew where to look. Sir Edward's gaze remained fixed across the street, his expression unreadable. With a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hand and pointed. "There," he said. Matthew Vaughan followed the direction of his gesture, his brow furrowing, as he took in the modest restaurant opposite. "The 24 Blackbirds?" he asked, confused. "Exactly." Matthew let out a short laugh, baffled. "It's an odd name, but I hear they serve quite decent food. I shall not take the risk of experimenting," Sir Edward remarked dryly. His eyes gleamed with something sharp, something Matthew couldn't quite place. "Being further from my nursery days than you are, my friend, I probably remember my nursery rhymes better. There is one that goes like this: sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds, baked in a pie, and so on. The rest is of no importance." Matthew frowned. "You think that name means something?" But Sir Edward wasn't listening anymore. A sudden tension took over his frame, as he wheeled around sharply. "Where are you going?" Matthew asked, struggling to keep up with the detective's sudden urgency. "Back to your house, my friend," Sir Edward said over his shoulder. They walked in silence, Matthew shooting increasingly puzzled glances at his companion, who remained deep in thought. Upon reaching the house, Sir Edward He strode to a drawer, pulled it open with swift precision, and retrieved a familiar black velvet bag. As he unfastened its silver clasp, his expression remained impassive. Then glancing at Matthew, he said firmly, "I need a moment alone." Matthew hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, leaving the room. As soon as the door clicked shut, Sir Edward upturned the bag onto the table. Coins scattered, rolling and clinking against the polished wood. His sharp gaze darted over them, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he sorted through the loose change. Then he stopped. A small nod of satisfaction confirmed what his memory had already told him. He reached for the bell pull and rang. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Martha stepped inside, wiping her hands on her apron. "You rang, sir?" Sir Edward's gaze locked onto her. His voice was quiet, almost casual. "You told me, Martha, that you had a small disagreement with your late mistress over a sixpence." Martha blinked, taken aback by the question. "Yes, sir. A new sixpence, if I recall correctly." "Yes, sir," she repeated, slowly. Sir Edward's fingers closed over something in his palm. He let a moment of silence stretch before speaking again. "Curious," he mused, "because, as I examine this loose change, I find 2 sixpences here, but neither of them is new." The room seemed to tighten around them. Martha's brow furrowed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "You see what that means, don't you?" Sir Edward pressed. "Someone did come to the house that evening. Someone to whom Miss Crabtree gave sixpence." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I think she gave it to him in exchange for this." With a swift, almost theatrical movement, he flicked his wrist, revealing a small scrap of paper between his fingers. He held it out towards her. Martha's breath hitched. It was the doggerel verse about unemployment. For a single heartbeat, everything was still. Then her face crumpled. "The game is up, Martha," Sir Edward said, his tone softer now. "You see, I know. You may as well tell me everything." Martha let out a broken sound, something between a sob and a sigh, and sank down onto a chair. Her hands trembled as she clutched at her apron, and when the tears came, they came in a sudden helpless flood. Sir Edward stood over her, waiting. The truth was coming, and it was coming now. Martha's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her hands clutched at the fabric of her apron, twisting it between her fingers. The weight of her secret, buried for so long, was finally breaking free. "It's true," she whispered. "It's all true." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a trembling hand against her lips before forcing herself to continue. "The bell didn't ring properly. I wasn't sure at first. I thought maybe it was just the wind rattling it. But then I thought I'd better check, just in case. I walked to the door, just as he struck her down. She shuddered violently, the memory tightening around her like a vice. Her eyes, wet with tears, lifted to meet Sir Edward's. The roll of £5 notes was lying on the table, right in front of her. She went on, voice hollow. It was the sight of them that made him do it, that and the fact that he thought she was alone. She had let him in herself, you see. If I'd answered the door, maybe it wouldn't have happened. A single sob tore free from her throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, she whispered. I was frozen, and then he turned, and I saw his face. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if blocking out the image could erase the horror of it. It was my boy, she said brokenly. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Martha let out a long, shuddering breath. Oh, he's been a bad one, always, since he was a child. I knew he had his father's blood in him. I gave him everything I could, every penny I had. It was never enough. He's been in jail twice, and now this. She dragged a shaking hand across her eyes. He must have come round to see me first, she continued, and when I didn't answer the door, Miss Crabtree must have heard the knock and gone herself. He wasn't expecting her, was caught off guard, and he panicked. He pulled out one of those unemployment leaflets, tried to pass himself off as some beggar, I suppose, and the mistress, being the kind-hearted woman she was, told him to come in. She let out a bitter laugh, choked with grief. She even got out a sixpence for him. Martha shook her head, and all the while the roll of notes was lying there, right where I'd left it after giving her the change. And the devil, she spat the word, as if cursing it. The devil got into my Ben, and he stepped behind her, and her voice broke. He struck her down. Sir Edward's face was unreadable. And then, he asked, his voice calm. Martha's fingers twisted harder in her apron. What could I do? She whispered. He's my own flesh and blood. His father was no good, and Ben takes after him. But he's still my son. She swallowed hard. I hustled him out of the house before anyone could see. I told him to run. Then I went back to the kitchen. I laid the table for supper, same as always. I pretended nothing had happened. Her voice was barely audible now. Do you think I was wicked, sir? Her eyes, wide and pleading, searched his face. I tried not to tell you any lies when you asked me questions. Sir Edward slowly rose to his feet. There was something almost gentle in his expression as he studied the broken woman before him. My poor woman, he said, and there was genuine feeling in his voice. I am very sorry for you, but you must know, the law will have to take its course. Martha bowed her head. He's fled the country, sir, she murmured. I don't know where he is. Sir Edward considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded. There's a chance then, he said quietly. A chance he may escape the gallows. But don't build your hopes upon it. He turned towards the door. Will you send Miss Magdalen to me? Martha wiped at her face with the edge of her apron, and nodded. When Magdalen arrived, her face pale and anxious, Sir Edward recounted the truth in his usual crisp, matter-of-fact manner. Oh, Sir Edward, Magdalen breathed when he had finished. How wonderful you are. You've saved us all. How can I ever thank you? Sir Edward smiled down at her, patting her hand in a manner both gracious and detached. He was, after all, a man used to admiration. Little Magdalen had been quite charming once, he mused. He remembered her at 70, fresh, dewy and full of life. But she had lost that bloom now, of course. With a small knowing smile, he said, next time you need a friend, I'll come straight to you. Magdalen finished eagerly. Sir Edward drew back, looking almost alarmed. No, he corrected swiftly. That's precisely what I don't want you to do. Go to a younger man. And with that he extricated himself from the grateful household with practiced ease, stepping out into the cold night air. Hailing a taxi, he sank into the seat with a sigh of relief. The case was solved. Even the charm of a dewy 17-year-old could not compare, he thought, with the quiet satisfaction of a well-stocked criminology library. As the taxi turned into Queen Anne's Close, his mind was already moving to the next mystery, the next puzzle waiting to be solved.